The Earth. This planet has been our home for tens of thousands of years. Millions of years, in fact. That is, if you start counting from when the first primate stood upright. But the Earth has been home to other forms of life for much, much longer. There has been life on Earth for hundreds of millions of years. We humans could never get our heads around a time span that vast. And yet, we can still see its effects. This planet looks a bit strange, don't you think? This is how the Earth would have looked before the continents drifted apart. One huge landmass, surrounded by an even bigger ocean. That's how our planet looked 300 million years ago. A single massive supercontinent called Pangaea. But even 300 million years ago, the nights were still dark. Humans brought light to that darkness. We started with fire. And as we got more intelligent, we discovered other techniques. But we always needed fuel. Fossil fuels that were made long, long ago. I wonder how many people realize that those fuels actually do come from fossils. The coal we dig up is literally made out of plants and animals that died hundreds of millions of years ago. It took a while for us to realize that, but it was inevitable that we would discover it. We've been discovering things for as long as there have been people. We have to find everything, and we have to explain it. But a lot of our discoveries have been pure chance. We've found things that no one was actually looking for. These excavations and quarries didn't only bring light to our darkness. We were looking for fuel. But we found something else in those old, old layers of Earth. Without even meaning to, we revealed the history of our planet. Pretty impressive, eh? There have been lots of excavations in this area of the TERRA.vita UNESCO Global Geopark. Geopark, a window into the past. For many years, people mined coal here to meet the energy needs of our society. The more we exploited the resources, the more we learned about the Earth's history. You see that layer of coal? That layer is 300 million years old. Can you imagine that? That's a really long time. We've studied that layer, and now we know roughly how the Earth looked when this coal was laid down. Long before the Carboniferous period began, the continents started to move towards each other. During the Carboniferous, that movement resulted in one big continent. Just imagine, back then, the separate continents we live in now were all stuck together. A supercontinent surrounded by a whole lot of water. 300 million years ago, everything was different. But this creature's ancestors were already roaming the seas. We'll see him again later. First, let's look at what was going on away from the water. In those days, the only greenery on the planet was ferns and trees. We've found their enormous fossils. When the plants and trees died, they ended up back in the water of the rivers, lakes, or swamps. But they did not decompose. Instead, they accumulated in many, many layers until they turned into peat. The layers just kept on piling up until they slowly turned to stone and became what we now know as coal. And in that period, there were insects that were as big as you and I. Quarries and mines have been around for a very long time. People mined for ores in the Middle Ages, too. That was a time when information was passed by word of mouth. So a lot of rumors did the rounds. You can see the effects of those rumors in the region to this day. If we believe the stories, the quarries and mines were built not by people, but by dwarves. When people don't understand something, they find their own explanations for it. People in the Middle Ages mined for metal ores. Now we know that those ores were created in the Permian period, 255 million years ago, when this environment was one big saltwater lagoon. The water evaporated, but the salt remained. That salt formed into layers, which were covered by new layers as the years went by. The groundwater drains through these layers of salt, and that makes the water salty. Natural water sources bring it back to the surface here. That salty water turned out to have healing powers, which is why there are so many spa resorts here now. We're in the heart of the Geopark TERRA.vita. $240 million years ago, the Triassic. That period was dry, arid, and hot. The area looked like the Wadden Sea looks now, but tropical. That transition from dry to wet and back again is still visible here. Actually, in the stones you walk on, you can see it in the Silver Lake. Here, outside the Silver Lake Gallery in the Hergel region. The alternation between dry and wet has been immortalized as a wave pattern in the surface of the stones. Another great experience awaits us here, but underground, in the mine shafts. In the Triassic period, the landscape was bare. Wet or dry, you could see for miles. It's very different now. The trees hide how it used to be. You could be wandering in the forest for ages without finding any sign of the Triassic period. Or you might stumble on it without even meaning to. The quarry looms between the trees, and all of a sudden you're looking through a window into the past. The quarry is a deep-down time machine. Look at the rocks. You can see the literal waves of the enormous Triassic Sea washing across the ground. And there may even be more to discover. This era lasted 50 million years. And it was then that reptiles began to walk on their hind legs, which would lead to a group of species that would dominate the land for the next 170 million years. "100 million years. I wonder if we humans will last that long. 100 million years after our story began, the Earth started to take a different form. The continents drifted apart. As you can imagine, it was a turbulent time across the planet, and it had a big impact on the ecosystem. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, not many species survived that grim time. But the dinosaurs did, and they would continue to thrive for a while yet. And there's no doubt that they walked the Earth here in UNESCO Global Geopark TERRA.vita. And here's the proof. You can see two sets of tracks on this rock wall. One, the hunter, and the other, its prey. Of course, they didn't actually walk up the wall. This area of ground was once flat, and it was probably underwater. It was a kind of marine landscape. At that time, northern and central Europe was a collection of islands. The dinosaurs probably crossed from one island to another. Thanks to the water, the tracks are beautifully preserved. Why is this piece of land now vertical? Mountains were formed during the next time period. They were created by the movement of the continents. As the land lifted up, the beach where the giants had walked lifted up too. That continental shift created the Vian Mountains. Those mountains will play an important role in a battle later in our story. There are so many beautiful places here where you can let your mind wander and imagine how you might once have been surrounded by giants. But These giant reptiles did not only rule the land, they also dominated in the air and the water. That said, in the water, they had to submit to another group of animals, the ammonites. The bottom of the sea that used to cover this area was strewn with their enormous shells. Their remains sank deep down to the seabed. But they wouldn't remain hidden there forever. You'll find them throughout the layer of limestone that was formed at that time at the bottom of the sea. Africa began to push up against Europe, just like when you push up against a tablecloth that caused the surface to wrinkle and fold, forming mountains. Even underwater, the biggest fold, or ridge, was formed to the south. It became the Alps. The northernmost products of this process were the Vian Mountains. Seen from the north, from Scandinavia, the tallest hill is here, in TERRA.vita, the Durenberg. Limestone contains a lot of minerals, and today those minerals nourish a profusion of plants. Walking through these woods, you can see the diversity of the trees and plants that flourish here thanks to the lime in the soil. And while you're exploring, you might even come across this old fortress. Keep your eyes open, because this fortress is built on a whole heap of fossils and ammonites. Tectonic shifts caused something very special to happen here. Layers that had been formed hundreds of millions of years ago, layers that were hidden under kilometers of earth, were pushed up to the surface. The only thing left for people to do was to discover the history of these places. Canyon Lengerich. This former limestone quarry is a window into the history of the Earth that can give us a glimpse of unimaginably ancient times. We found out which mighty beasts roamed the area, and that they suddenly were not there anymore. For millions of years, this was a landmass. Until the land collapsed and trillions of gallons of water rushed in. The land was transformed into a gigantic primordial sea. Water as far as the eye can see. Let's travel together through this period of the past, about 56 million years ago. In those days, this was a shallow sea, a primordial North Sea. The coastline of that sea was formed by high ground you can still walk on today. 7 million years ago, the land slowly rose again, and the North Sea retreated. Nothing was left but sand and shark's teeth. Millions of shark's teeth. When this area was covered in water, our oversized friend swam here too. Remember? We encountered his ancestors at the start of the story, 300 million years ago. That really makes you think. We haven't even been here for 1 million years. And yet, we've had such a major influence on this environment. A lot of the work has stopped for now. Come and see for yourself. There are huge teeth hidden in this sand. With a bit of luck, you could find one. The receding waters coincided with another major change, with the movements of the continents and changes in the ocean currents. The climate cooled and ice shields gradually formed around the poles. That cooling heralded the era of the Ice Ages. Just under 4 million years ago, it was the turn of the Ice Ages to dominate this area. Massive flows of ice from Scandinavia carried sand, stone, and clay to northern Europe. 300 meters of ice, crushing everything in its path. And it brought along the boulders that are so characteristic of our geopark. The stones that were used to build the megalithic tombs. The animals that roamed the area at that time had evolved to a point where we can recognize them. Alongside mammoths and woolly rhinos, there were reindeer, wolves, and bears. They're a bit bigger than their modern descendants, but they're still recognizable here in Older Diesen, for instance. Huge glaciers forced their way into this region, leaving enormous hills of rock and sand in their wake. When the ice melted, it was clear where the ice sheet had stopped. These moraines, these ridges pushed up by the ice, are now the Ankum Heights, the second biggest terminal moraine in the world. The ice melted, the rain came less frequently, and the lakes dried out, leaving behind a soggy landscape covered with bogs. To us, this place is idyllic. In the past, people were afraid of it. The marsh was neither water nor land, constantly shifting. A place inhabited by spirits, where the realm of the gods was almost within reach. Just like a lot of North German heathland, that Venner Moor was once covered in stagnant water. Because the marsh was cut off from rivers and other sources of fresh water, the oxygen in this lake eventually got used up. Dead plants decomposed slowly, and not even completely. What was left behind became peat, New plants grew on that peat, and over thousands of years, the low-lying marsh became a raised bog. As the climate got warmer, life returned to northern Europe. These animals were followed by a new kind of predator. Predators without equal who could adapt anything to suit their needs. Humans. However sodden the marsh was, however lacking in nutrients, however acidic, people learned to live with it. In fact, they turned it to their advantage. About 2,000 years ago, the Roman general Varus and his men encountered an army that was well adapted to the extreme conditions of the Germanic marshland. The Germans' equipment was very basic, and they had no military training. And yet, a man named Arminius led them to victory against the Romans, thanks to the landscape, which they were so well able to use to their advantage. They lured the Romans into the area between the bogs and the nearby Calcrise hill. The Germans seized the moment and attacked. It's one of the worst defeats in Roman history. You can learn all about Rome's greatest defeat here, in the museum. Our soils have kept so many things safe for us. We've found a lot of items that were lost during that battle, including the legendary mask. Who knows what is still lying here, waiting to be discovered? There's still a lot left to find. But not all the quarries and sandpits are active now. We've discovered that when we leave them in peace, the sites develop a vast new biodiversity. That's happened at Canyon Lengerich and in the forests. A big part of our UNESCO Global Geopark is now a protected area. If we let nature take its course, who knows what could emerge from that environment?